Before the break, I told you about Project 2025's longstanding effort to villainize queer and transgender Americans, equating LGBTQ identity with pornography and obscenity. Joining me now to discuss all of this is Amara Jones, the chair of the Transgender Law Center. She's also the co-founder and CEO of Translash Media. As well, we have Leah Lippman. She is a professor at the University of Michigan Law School, the co-founder of Women Also Know Law, and my co-host on the Strict Scrutiny podcast. Amara, you've been talking about the Heritage Foundation's longstanding efforts to push an anti-trans ideology for years. The Heritage Foundation already achieved some of these goals to erase trans people through state-level legislation that they pushed during the Trump administration. Much of this is still in effect today. What is the impact of this legislation? What will be the likely impact if there is a second Trump presidency?
Well, I think that the reality is that a second Trump administration presents people who are trans and gender expansive with an existential threat, an existential potential assault by the administration. And that's because they already had a test run in the first administration. As a matter of fact, one of the key architects of Project 2025 is Roger Severino, who is the person who constructed many of the anti-trans policies during the first Trump administration that he actually workshopped while at the Heritage Foundation. So this is something that they've already had a dry run at. And so they will come in with a much stronger sense of where the pressure points are. And I think that what we really need to understand is that Project 2025 wouldn't be possible without this original test run, where they experimented on how to weaponize the federal government against a group of Americans. And all they've done with Project 2025 is to wrap up all of that learning that they gained from this broad assault on trans people and just expanded the aperture to a variety of other communities, which is why there's an outcry. And so I think that we need to understand that the origins of Project 2025 and its thinking come from this original assault in the Trump administration.
So, Leah, Amara's spoken about the existential threat to trans people, but there's a broader discussion of gender and sexuality in Project 2025, and it's about equating even discussion of gender and sexuality with pornography. What's behind this tactic? How is this going to be successful, and what will it achieve?
I think what they are trying to do is enforce traditional gender roles throughout the country and basically give people the freedom, not to defy traditional gender roles, but instead to require everyone else to perform them. And this comes up, for example, when they declare that the Department of Justice would be used to basically undermine civil rights protections for the transgender community as well as the queer community. That is, they want the federal government to be arguing it is unconstitutional to prohibit discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity because that doesn't allow the people who want to discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity to do that. And you combine that with their efforts to basically force motherhood on American women, and they are desperately trying to take us back to a time when people were not allowed to be themselves and decide for themselves when they would become mothers and what they would do with their lives.
Amara, you've already touched a little bit about this, so this is an invitation maybe to elaborate on it. But the goals of the Heritage Foundation and a lot of Christian conservatism has been to villainize trans people. And so fears about transness and gender identity in general. And some of this is definitely about trying to limit the performance of norms that aren't consistent with traditional gender norms. What do you see happening in the future Trump administration, if one happens, that will be more about that or expand these efforts in your community?
Well, I think the two things. I think one of the things we have to understand is that unlike progressives, to be quite frank about it, and also liberals, the Christian nationalist movement does not see the trans people in isolation from a range of other issues. They see it as directly connected to abortion. They see it directly connected to bodily autonomy overall. They see it directly connected to issues of immigration because so much of what they are thinking when it comes to these groups of people is the preservation of white Christian culture in the United States. And that's why there's such a fervent focus on it, because it's not for them an isolated isolated or marginal issue. And it's actually a central one in their project in order to maintain white Christianity. So I just wanted to state that. So within that, I think what we're going to see is the literal erasure of trans people. I think that you would see the federal government not allow for trans people to be recognized in any way, both in terms of IDs, both in terms of healthcare, in terms of education. Schools would not have to be safe. Trans people would not receive equal access to healthcare. Trans people, because of this erasure, would face open discrimination on jobs and in housing. And I think that the whole point is to literally erase the idea that trans people are real through all of the instruments of the federal government. And it's not going to stop there. I don't know an authoritarian regime that has targeted one group of people that stops with that group of people.
No, that's an excellent point. Leah, in order to erase a group of people, you actually need hand-picked personnel in every level of government who are with the program. And the Heritage Foundation and Project 2025 has been very clear about installing hand-picked conservatives who are willing to go along with this project. Amara already mentioned this person, but I think it's worthwhile to highlight him again. Project 2025 co-author Roger Severino, who was the director of the DeVos Center for Religion and Civil Society at the Heritage Foundation in 2015, before being appointed to direct the Office of Civil Rights in the Department of Health and Human Services during the Trump administration. He is known to be anti-LGBTQ rights, and in his role at HHS, he removed protections for LGBTQ people, allowing doctors to refuse to treat patients based on their sexuality or gender identity. What is his likely role in a future Trump administration if that happens, and what will the impact of that be for the trans community?
So it's difficult to know exactly where they would place him, but I think it would definitely be part of the plan to install him somewhere where he would be able to carry out these plans, perhaps as the head of the Department of Health and Human Services, where, as you know, part of Project 2025's plan is basically to deny civil rights protections on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity in the areas of healthcare and education. One of their core platforms is to argue that the Supreme Court's decision in Bostock, which held that employers could not discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity, and to argue that that decision doesn't apply to healthcare, education, and a variety of other social services that the Department of Health and Human Services administers. And, you know, other people who are part of Project 2025 and author different chapters, like Ken Cuccinelli, have argued that, you know, homosexuality is a sin. And so these are the kinds of people that they are hoping to install at the head of the federal government to implement their vision of denying rights to transgender people, the queer community, women, and more. As Amara notes, they never just stop with one community. Instead, they just lump it all together under some umbrella to villainize, you know, different communities and distract from the fact that, you know, the biggest problems facing our country is frankly not where students pee or, you know, what sports teams they are on. There are real healthcare crises, crises of gun violence, and this is part of an effort to distract the country from those real problems and allow them to then institute their agenda, which no one wants, and, you know, force it on the country.
Amara, one of the things that's so striking about this attack on the trans community is that it's not especially original. The fear-mongering about transness, and in particular about the proposed danger that trans identity poses to children, is something that conservatives have been doing for years. And it's not even especially accurate. They are pushing falsehoods that kids are being pushed into surgeries and that there's all of this regret among trans adults who have received gender-affirming treatment. All of this is a gross mischaracterization of trans healthcare. Can you say more about this standard play and how it is being translated to the American public as this assault continues?
Well, I think that one of the important things to think about is that this entire effort to disinform the American public about trans people as a part of a larger political project, as a part of a larger political and religious project, I should say, is the result of a lot of and this will sound strange, a lot of intelligent brain work on their side. They have spent years focus grouping and workshopping and working on messaging and figuring out how do you get Americans to be uncomfortable with the idea of trans people. The American Principles Project did a lot of this work. And so therefore, the reason why the disinformation is so impactful is because it has been researched. They understand that these are the messages that are going to break through and seize hold and make people uncomfortable. So I think that one of the things that's different about the fear-mongering now is that it actually is grounded in a lot of research and thought. And that's how they've been able, in a relatively quick period of time, to move the conversation about trans people to the center of American political conversation as a part of this project. So I think we cannot underestimate and say that this is something that we've seen before. This is not what they did in the 1980s. This is not Anita Bryant. This is not sort of Jerry Falwell spilling out. This is the result of a group of people who are very intelligent, who understand the way that American conversation and media and journalism work, and have gone about hacking the system through some really smart ways. And we can't underestimate that.
Really important context. Amara Jones and Leah Lippman, thank you so much for joining us.